Hi and welcome to our webinar, Trauma in Shipping Next Steps. This webinar is a follow-up webinar to our recent workshop that was aiming to spread knowledge and raise awareness about psychological trauma at sea. We are once again very fortunate to host a brilliant panel of speakers who will create the framework for a fireside-style discussion where an open dialogue encourages creative solution and share knowledge. Our moderator for today's discussion is Rachel Glynn Williams, consultant clinical psychologist at Seaways Psychology Services, and our partner in crime during our project to spread knowledge about trauma to our industry. To make this webinar more interactive, you are free to put all your questions in the Q&A box below on your Zoom window. We will spend the last 10 minutes in the webinar answering them. Thank you. Rachel, go ahead.
Thank you ever so much, Johanna, and thank you to Alandia for the opportunity to work with you all again on this Next Steps webinar. And as Johanna says, we are very fortunate again to have brought together a panel of people who are passionate about this subject of trauma in shipping and bring their wealth of experience and expertise to the discussion today. We heard late last night that Captain Jürgen Lauren from Stena Line just cannot make it with us today, so we'll miss his contribution about the amazing work that Stena Line have been doing. We hope to hear from him again at a different event, hopefully. But we're pleased that Captain Marty Semioki from Alandia could step into his position on the panel today. And just to mention our panel, we have Anne Till from Ocean Infinity, Chris Gascoigne from Solis Marine, Marty Semioki, as I said, from Alandia's loss prevention team, and also Dr. Penny Blackburn from Psy Consultation. And we'll hear from each of those panel members in just a wee while. But first of all, I'd just like to refresh our memories of the first Trauma in Shipping webinar we held on the 10th of November. So first of all, I presented on what we know of the normal human stress response in relation to shocking or frightening events. And we then asked the question of our audience, what comes to mind when you think about critical incidents at sea? And we had a Mentimeter poll, and these were the results from major casualty events such as fires and groundings to the more individual, personal and interpersonal traumas such as injury and psychological abuse. We looked at ways of managing those normal responses to extraordinary events in ourselves and others, including the 5 golden rules in our next slide there, just some basic ways of supporting each other. After an event, we looked at the implications for vessel safety of trauma and also of personal well-being when people continue to struggle. And we looked at the kind of help that ought to be available when people are impacted by events. We had some amazing speakers from around the industry, starting with Captain Sanwin, Captain Tusa and Karina Rayson, who shared their experiences professionally and their lived experiences of traumatic incidents at sea. And we then heard from people in and around the maritime industry who have recognised and responded to the need to provide support to those affected by untoward events. We had Kath Kerr, our business continuity expert, and Reverend Andy Bauman spoke about the Mission to Seafarers work in providing culturally agile post-incident support to crews, such as those on the Ever Given. And Becky Newdick from Safer Waves talked about her charity providing email support to those at sea who've been the target of sexual violence. And Captain Terry Ogg, my colleague from Recall Recover, spoke about our trauma-informed marine casualty investigative interview protocol and our crew wellbeing continuum. All of those presentations are available still on the Alandia events website. So without further ado, we can follow on now with this webinar where we want to consider the next steps. What are the next steps with regard to trauma-informed ways of working in maritime? So I'd like to turn to our guests now, and as if by magic, they'll appear as we're turning on our cameras. And first of all, if I could speak to yourself, Anne Till from Ocean Infinity, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and why your interest in this issue of trauma in shipping?
Thank you very much, Rachel. Happy to be here for this webinar this morning. So I'm actually here in, I think, 3 or 4 different hats. So I am Chief Vessel Operator for Ocean Infinity. So I want us to be a company that leads by example in how to deal with potential trauma that may happen to people working in the company, whether they're seafarers or whether they're ashore. I've had previous positions in both HSE and operations and DPA for shipping companies. So I've had experience of responding to some serious vessel-based incidents. So I've experienced from the after effects of those incidents from that perspective, as well as somebody who spent a number of years at sea myself and experienced trauma, both for vessel-based incidents, so near miss type incidents, collision, piracy, as well as some traumatic interpersonal events. And also finally, as a volunteer for Safer Waves, as you just mentioned, a charity that provides emotional support for all genders who have experienced sexual issues whilst at sea. So yeah, my interest is definitely in a number of different areas in this topic.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much for that, Anne. So you're coming at this from lots of different angles, having experienced it and witnessed it in the impact of events in others as well. And how about yourself, Chris Gascoigne from Solis Marine?
Morning, Rachel.
Hello.
Hiya. I'm again similar to Anne. I'm coming at this from a number of different angles. I started my career in the marine industry at about 18 years old as a cadet, and I went to sea shortly thereafter, probably for around 10 years. During that time, I was aware of various different events on ships, from fatality, grievous bodily harm, fires, collisions, attempted suicides, all manner of different traumatic events that occurred during my seagoing career. And I was able to see the aftermath of some of those events on individual colleagues as well. So that piqued my interest in this a long time ago. And I'm very aware that whilst seafarers often have to deal with events such as fires and medical emergencies, for example, they're not expected to do that on a daily basis. They're not the military, they're not A&E doctors, but they are expected to deal with those events when they occur. So it's clear to me that working at sea carries extra risks, and we expect our seafarers to be able to deal with them and to continue to function. So that's part of my interest in it. I think the other thing which I find very interesting through my most recent career, which I've been doing for about 13 years, is investigating casualties. And one of the things that I've become acutely aware of is that whilst it's very easy to put measures on the common trauma events, if I can put it that way, fires, explosions, fatalities, different people are affected by trauma in different ways. And I'm personally aware of a number of people who've been massively affected long-term by investigations, for example, where they've been found to be the person at blame or the person that made the bad decision. And that can have very, very long-lasting and profound impacts on them and their productivity. So that's my interest in it, really.
That's great, and I think we share that interest as well in the effects of investigations. Obviously, they're important, but they're not without their own impact. So thank you, Chris. And if I could come to yourself now, Marty, just to tell us a little bit about your background and your interest in trauma in shipping.
Well, I think belong to the same club with the previous 2 panelists, background at sea. I've been at sea 21 years and roughly half of that time as a captain. And along the lines with Chris, seen most of the things that can happen to humans and under the vessels and assets while serving in the industry. And at the same time came to a realization that for example, I had a piracy encounter that there are very little tools to deal with it. Well, if you need more help, so you can call us anytime. Okay, thank you for that. And the very reason we actually having these webinars were actually when I had the opportunity to listen to you, Rachel, during the Marine Insurance Nordic, and you presented the psychological trauma, and I came to a realization this is something that the industry needs, and the industry is definitely not aware of. So there's some work to be done and lots of awareness to be raised, and unfortunately, Jürgen couldn't make it. I would have asked him the direct question whether they have trauma in some shape or form in their company, SMS.
Mm-hmm. That's grand. Thank you ever so much, Martin. Obviously, with your different hats on, as well as our as Anne and Chris as well, having that facility to come from different angles on this, as well as your own personal experience, what you've seen at sea. And so, Dr. Penny Blackburn, if I come to yourself now, in terms of your background and what your particular interest is in trauma and shipping.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to join the panel. Yeah, as Rachel said, I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. I have had a long-standing interest in trauma. In fact, my first doctoral dissertation was in the prevention of post-traumatic stress disorder in firefighters. And right from early days of my career, then I've been interested in trauma, and I spent about 8 years at a tertiary level treatment service for post-traumatic stress in London. And I was there at the time when the London bombings happened, and we set up a program of support we were right in the middle of where the bombs all went off. So it was our sort of area, and we set up a response system, which has been used later in the Grenfell Tower disaster and in the Manchester Arena disaster as well. So I then went into the humanitarian sector, and I worked for a number of years as well overseas in the humanitarian sector with people who'd been affected by all kinds of critical incidents, war, trauma, disaster, this kind of thing. But my father was a seafarer, and so when I transitioned back to the UK, I was invited to speak about humanitarian work in mental health in the humanitarian sector at a conference. And I accepted that invitation because my father was a seafarer, and so I was interested to see what shipping industry was doing in the general arena of mental health. And so for the last 6 years or so, I've pretty much dedicated all of my work to working in the shipping industry and the maritime context. So it's really great for me that these two things are sort of coming together. So I think, yeah, it's been a process of development in the shipping industry, of awareness raising around mental health generally. And so it's really interesting as well that the shipping industry is getting to the point where trauma awareness is becoming something people are starting to think about. So yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks, Rachel.
That's great. It's great to have you with us, Penny. And I think there's, as we can see on our panel, there's a wealth of experience and expertise and knowledge that we've got here today. So I'm really grateful to everyone for bringing that to us. I guess my first question will be or my next question will be to yourself, Chris, just thinking about what advantages there might be for the industry in becoming more trauma aware. Are there what kinds of things might happen differently, do you think, if the industry is more alert to the possibility of the impact of events on seafarers and those shoreside as well?
Yeah, I personally think that there's a lot of advantages to the industry becoming more trauma aware and trauma focused. And I think most of my beliefs around this are about the fact that I think that crews should be valued resources rather than commodities. An owner, a manager, and indeed the crew themselves want to invest a lot in their crew. And I think it's only right that after an incident, regardless of what that incident is, that the crew are aware of the possible impacts that trauma may have on them, and also that the support network's there as required. And I think that one of the reasons I say that is not only from the individual's perspective, but also from the other interested parties. These traumatic events can have very profound impacts on people, as I said earlier, and they can be long lasting. And what an owner doesn't want is a crew that's not focused, can't function properly, not engaged, because that leads to more risk in the future. And that's putting aside all the potential problems that individual may have at home as a consequence of the event. So I'd seen multifaceted positives in this for everybody involved in shipping, really. So I think it's a good thing.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Yeah, so it's that multi-layered, isn't it? It's for the individuals and for the industry at large. And how about yourself, Penny? What advantages would you see as the industry becomes more trauma aware? Would you say that there are any risks of not paying attention to the impacts of events upon seafarers and people shoreside as well? Oh,
sorry, muted. I think one of the things that jumps to mind straight away is what Marty was saying, that often people are just asked, everybody all right? And everybody goes, yes, sir, and then carry on as usual. And that's really just not enough. And we've come across cases recently where people have not had the support they needed at the time and gone back on another vessel later and not been able to function. And then you have an issue where somebody's really struggling. You might have to repatriate them. It costs money. It's, all those things. I think Kath spoke really well in her talk in your last workshop about continuity of business. So even just from a business perspective, actually being able to get on with business as quickly and effectively as possible, whilst also supporting your team to recover, is really important. I think there's also a duty of care, as Chris was saying, that actually it's really important that the whole industry treats crew well, that actually no shipping company, whatever sector you're working in, the seafarers are the most valuable asset. You can't run the business without them. And so taking care of them is part of responsible employment, I think. We also know from a more sort of technical research, clinical psychology perspective, we also know that the way people respond immediately in the aftermath of trauma or a critical incident is really important in how they're able to recover. So if the environment is right and people have the right kinds of ways of coping and understanding what's happening to them and how they're feeling, we greatly enhance the chances that they will recover quickly and be able to get back to normal. On the other hand, if those things aren't there, and everybody's avoiding talking about it and they think they're going crazy, etc., and particularly if people feel like they might be responsible, or if they're blamed, or there's anger, or there's that kind of thing around, you're drastically increasing the risk of people struggling with a longer term problem. And so that post-trauma environment is a really important time to get it right, to prevent problems from happening, but also to support people to recover effectively.
I just quickly, Rachel, sorry, I completely agree with everything that Penny's just said. And one thing I would like to add to that is that in my experience, if the effects of trauma can be identified early and dealt with properly, then they can have a massive positive impact on the individual going forward, and that person can become even more valuable. Because they can learn, they can take the positives from what was otherwise a very negative situation and apply that going forward. So it's a long path. I mean, I'm aware of people that have been impacted for this for decades, and they didn't get the help at the beginning. And if they had, then things may have been different for them. So it's a big spot on, I think, Penny.
I think that's a good message as well, Chris. We know from the research that once people have got an established problem of post-traumatic stress disorder, to give it its that sort of title, if people do start to struggle with that and it becomes established, it doesn't go away by itself. So they need help and support to recover. PTSD is eminently treatable, but without support to recover, people can struggle for decades, as you say. So I think that's a really good point, Chris, to be aware of.
I think so. I think that's some really great points there. And I think as Reverend Andy Bauman pointed out at our last webinar, it's important for us to remain culturally aware as well of the idea of how distress can show itself across the world. You know, we don't want to just take our Western views and impose them as a template on the people that we might meet in the seafaring industry, and so being aware of how that can show up in terms of physical health, in terms of what works as well. I mean, I think that one of the things that you know, Penny was just saying there was about the importance and the value of that really recent post-incident environment, and how it can be it's a great time, if there is such a thing to say, where interventions can really have an impact on preventing and preventing distress from occurring. And one of the important things is that social environment as one of our golden rules. It's about connections. And it's about, you know, what a perfect opportunity to pull the crew together, to be talking to people about what the ordinary responses are to extraordinary events, and drawing on the power and the bonding of the crew there to support each other in very ordinary ways. It hasn't got to be all full of technological, psychological jargon stuff. It's just around doing what works in a very, but in a more deliberate way from a social support point of view. So thank you. Oh, sorry, Marty.
Yeah, on that note, I would like to bring in a slightly different angle in a way that recognizing the weak signals and starting early. That, I mean, shipboard environment, it can be in lots of different reasons a stressful environment, and you are induced to different levels and degree of trauma. For example, that the anchor failed, or you were blown from the berth, and you have to scramble the whole crew to get the situation under control. And for example, one contractor voyage, you have lots of these events, and it sort of adds on. And what can you do? I mean, for example, a short briefing when something like this has happened, it makes a big difference that you talked about it, and also what Penny was saying here, the silence about the mental health issues. This is part of the same disease that you stiff it up. I mean, if you're here, you're supposed to be able to take it and cope with it, but not everybody's like that. And I think that we need a greater awareness too. And I think to start with the simple tools, that when you have a major, like a bombs or big things, then everybody understands that this is traumatic and you need more. But also not forgetting the simple, everyday, easy tools that could be used and formalized in the company procedures.
Absolutely, and I think that brings us on to our oh, sorry, Anne.
I was just going to very quickly chip in, because I know we need to move on, but I was just going to link with Marty's point there, that we're very good at an industry generally now in focusing on toolbox talks before a job or before a critical operation. What we're generally poor at industry-wide is post-job reviews on a sort of pure safety perspective. But when we consider an incident or a sort of off-nominal condition that's happened during daily work, something that has the potential for trauma, it's that sort of post-job review, whether that is a briefing or whether that might just simply be a games night or a barbecue once you've left port, because you know there has been this traumatic incident, you've had a stevedore fall in a hold or whatever it may be. And I see very big similarities to how we can manage pure health and safety better to how we can manage trauma better, in that closing the loop from pre-job toolbox talks through to post-job reviews. And in this case, it can literally be as simple as that, forming that human connection. Seafarers can be quite isolated and resilient people at the best of times, and independent, and that's some of the strengths of a seafarer. But that post-incident response is similar to me as a post-job review for a normal job, and getting people together to give them the chance to talk without saying, this is for you to talk and share because you've undergone trauma, but just to have that safe, open space to get it out there.
Absolutely, definitely. And I
if
think,
I may,
oh, sorry, Marty, could I respectfully ask you just to hold on to that point just a little bit longer? It may be that we've got time to pick it up in a little while, but just in terms of the issues you were talking about just before, Marty, around what barriers there might be to providing a more helpful response. It sounds like whether at least those of us here and perhaps many of our audience will have a good idea about what works for ourselves. You know, if we can think about any shocks or distress that we've had in our own lives and anywhere, we know what works in terms of an interpersonal response from other people. But I wonder what barriers there might be, do you think, in terms of providing that helpful response to crew after a crisis, or shoreside staff after a crisis? Perhaps, Anne, I come back to you first of all. What would you say gets in the way of people being able to get hold of that, to get that helpful response from people after a traumatic incident?
I think I'd put it down to probably, I'd say 3 key areas. The first one, which I think we've all touched on, is an overall lack of training and awareness industry-wide as to the effects of trauma, understanding their effects, and normalizing the fact that trauma happens. Trauma is not necessarily just the bomb going off in London. There are many events that happen in seagoing life, and I think many of us have touched on them already this morning, that can elicit a trauma response. And this is normal. This does not make you any less of a man or a woman, or for a crewing department, it does not make your seafarer suddenly less able and less employable. And likewise, training the leaders on board that their crew may, for various reasons, encounter trauma responses, and that is fine, that is natural, and to have better training and understanding what trauma is, being more trauma informed, which leads on to my second about having accessible support services. We've seen in over the last sort of 5-6 years, especially with the growth of technology and accessibility for seafarers, that there are services available, whether that's seafarer helplines. Communicate that well to the crew on board. And then finally, for certain aspects of our industry, it can be pure commercial schedule, whereas we will postpone the sailing of a vessel if the ship is unseaworthy. But how often do you hear that the schedule's postponed because the crew are unseaworthy and the crew are not fit for duty because they've gone either a traumatic event, or we've seen lately the incident that was in the news for a vessel where the master was fatigued but told to sail. The same risks exist if a traumatic incident has occurred, and we would not sail a ship if there was a hole in the hull, but we would sail a ship if a number of the leadership team have just undergone a very traumatic incident. There had been a large fire on board and a crew member had died, for instance, or a significant piracy attack. So I think these are the barriers where the industry just needs to be more trauma informed and considered in how we run our industry.
Thank you, Anne. And coming back to yourself, Marty, do you think about barriers to people taking forward more trauma informed actions? Do you feel as if from your experience or from people that you deal with, that there are worries about commercial impact of being too interested in the impact of events on people in shipping? As you'll know, when we were setting up our first webinar, there was some interesting conversations on social media there where somebody was saying, well, you don't play with coal if you want to keep your hands clean, or something similar. Basically, shipping's dangerous, get on with it. Do you feel there's what kind of barriers do you feel that there's around for doing the thing that works?
Yeah, well, thank you. Actually, now I get my opportunity to continue what I was about to say, and more importantly, to thank you, Anne, for very important points made. I would like to start from the toolbox and what happens before, what happens after that. Generally, our industry could improve on the feedback culture. One thing is the maritime resource management concepts on board, that the feedback loop is going up and down, but also between the vessels and the shore management. And there I would like to challenge the shore management a bit, that the crewing department or the HR department might not be the best experts in handling trauma. And it's equally important that that organization as well understand what is a trauma and how where you have the professional help and what should be done in certain situations. Yeah, I mean, I've never come across a company that says that we take poor care of our people and we look at the money and the people last. Quite the contrary, but I think the reality is that the companies are there to make money, but there needs to be a balance. That I mean, if there's too much production, you won't have any safety, and if there's only safety, you won't have any production. And in each situation, and find the right balance, and that comes back to the feedback culture, that there's people on board for a reason, and quite often they are the best judge of the situation. Or if there's a certain event on board, that then, well, can you take care of it? No, I mean, this is serious, and quite a few of the crew are impacted. And then I think at the end of the day, not even going to the repatriation, but the other possible consequences, it's much cheaper to have the professional help, the right things moment one, rather than a year or a few later. I hope that answers your question, Rachel.
That's great. Thank you, Marty. So it's that joined up thinking, isn't it? It's that feedback. It's having organisations and systems that learn and that can feedback into themselves. And I guess I'm curious about whether people have seen any sort of evidence of good practice regarding where people have been supported in maritime after being involved in traumatic incidents. Or can we bring any examples of that to our discussion? Chris, could I come to you first?
Yeah, it might be a very short response, actually. I think there's been lots said recently, possibly as a consequence of the publicity around COVID and seafarers being stuck on ships, about mental, well-being of crews and all those things. So I think the whole mental health issue has taken, it's becoming more and more prominent now. There's all sorts of publications by the insurers, and also by other stakeholders. There's other initiatives being taken. But in terms of dealing with trauma, I've not seen anything specific to that. It's a shame that I think Anne's probably got more of an operational experience of the types of procedures and policies that ships have to deal with these things. But in my experience, I've not seen one. I'm not saying that they're not out there, but I don't remember seeing a shipping operating procedure that says how we're going to deal with this. You'll often see, as was said earlier, an incident happen, and then the ship sails, and that's the end of the incident, which isn't necessarily a good or right thing. Putting commercial pressures aside, obviously. I think, like I say, I think it's something that's going to grow in prominence, but it's probably in its early stages. Hence this webinar.
Yeah, I think it's important for us just to notice that there isn't a lot of evidence out there that we can point to, at least at the moment, where the trauma and post-incident support is routinely stitched into emergency procedures. Yeah,
I mean, I'd be very interested if there's any of the attendees that are aware of these things, obviously. But personally, I'm not. And I think the other thing that, just probably digressing a little bit, is that there'll be an incident, and we'll expect the crew to deal with that. But it might be them that's, they may have made the mistake that's caused it, and they haven't got any backup to deal with it. So it's, if there's a procedure there, or if an owner can get someone to the ship. Again, I know the limitations of shipping, but you'll often have an incident and there'll be no one there to support the crew afterwards. Not always, but it does happen.
Yes, so seafarers are in a curious position of being perhaps the person that's made an error, or been part of the incident, being the first responder and the person that's affected by it as well, and has to sort it out. So it's a really quite sort of layered position to be in, isn't it?
But it's entirely the nature of the job, and we accept that when we do it. So it's part of the role.
And how about yourself, Anne? Would you be able to bring some examples of where perhaps post-trauma support has been available and has worked well?
See, I was going to bring an example of one or two cases where that has been provided and it has worked well, but just first I'm actually going to link with Chris's just last comment, just from pure personal experience, which is something I don't often share, to be honest, but a number of years ago now, and talking quite a few years ago, I was involved in a near miss, quite a serious navigational near miss incident where I was part of the bridge team and under suspension for a period of months. And it was quite traumatic in the nature of the near miss and the potential consequences involved. And there was no support given whatsoever. And it was a very difficult time for my own mental health in not knowing what was going to happen to my job, my ticket, reliving the event over and over. So I've got the experience personally from exactly what Chris was just saying. And I can see it in modern day with incidents I've been involved with, that we can be very focused on investigating what happened in an incident or near miss, but our focus on the seafarer who may, and we supposedly have a no blame culture, but the seafarer that is implicated as being a causal factor tends to not get focus on any potential support for the trauma that they have been involved with, bearing in mind that I tend to remind shipping companies quite regularly that seafarers do not join a ship with the intention of having an injury, causing an accident. It's not something that's willfully done, and sometimes they can be vilified and treated like criminals rather than people that do need trauma support. So I'd just like to very much support Chris's point there. In terms of best practices, I have personally been involved in 2 serious incidents from the shoreside management perspective, where, without going into too many details, obviously, there was psychological support given to the crew in one instance, which was a very near fatality, and a number of the crew had literally saved the guy's life, but obviously was very traumatic for a number of the crew. And it was in an African port, yet we managed to mobilize a psychologist to come on board and give some immediate support. However, that was, I believe, where the support ended, and I would have liked to have seen some more follow-up support rather than just in the I think it was 2 or 3 days after the incident. The other incident was far more serious in nature, multiple fatalities, and some of the survivors, they did get quite significant psychological support, but that was basically due to the nature of it being a very serious casualty, which is great, and it is a best practice, but we should not be waiting till we have very serious marine casualties before we elicit that sort of response. The other best practice I can quickly think of is that I believe now that certainly in the UK, cadets are being given mental health first aid training as a standard. And this, I think, is an absolute excellent initiative. Unfortunately, we do have STCW that sets forward model courses for first aid training, and I would like to see mental health being placed in model courses for STCW first aid training and given the same provenance as physical first aid training. but the sheer fact that we are starting to officially train our seafarers in mental health, I think, is a best practice that does need to be applauded.
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. So there's some green shoots perhaps to be seen, and so I guess there's a number of different ideas there. We talked about training for cadets, maybe for leaders as well, and closing that loop, making sure that the organisations can learn from their experiences, having support in place at a basic on board level, but also pathways into more professional support, as Penny's mentioned. So there's lots of different ideas that perhaps might make a difference, different trauma-informed actions. I guess I'd like to turn to Penny now to help us understand how we can pull all this together. With your work in ICE1, you created that really great guidance that doesn't exist anywhere else, that mentally healthy ships guidance, on a guide for industry and how to develop their approach to mental health in general in shipping. I wonder what recommendations you might have in about 2 minutes. It's a big question for a short amount of time, with regard to helping organisations to prepare and respond appropriately for supporting people after events at sea and shoreside.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I mean, it is a huge question, of course. And I've just put the Mentally Healthy Ships link to that on in the chat there. So anybody that wants to read that, please download it. It's free to download. I think what's key is what people have alluded to in this conversation around preparation, being prepared. And in the same way, of course, that you have operational procedures, you have plans, contingency plans in place for a critical incident and what happens afterwards in terms of technical operations. There needs to be an element in there about the crew and about the impact of the event on the crew as well. I think, however, that it fits within a wider framework of mental health in the industry as well. That I think what you were saying, Marty, about day-to-day stressors, and it's a tough job being a seafarer. There's lots of stress factors involved. There's lots of day-to-day issues that are involved, and COVID, of course, has highlighted all of that for everybody in lots and lots of ways. That there's stuff around that general planning and preparation and awareness of mental health, around reducing stigma, around looking at the risks to people's well-being within the company context, whichever way you operate, where you operate, how you operate, what are the particular risks for psychological well-being for your crew. And in Mentally Healthy Ships there, it looks at some of that best practice in terms of policy and how you put together policies and procedures, systems and structures. And so it looks at that, what are the risks to mental health, looking at mitigating those risks in exactly the same way you would be doing for any other kinds of risk management in the shipping industry. So that's one element. The other element is around mental health promotion. So how can we create a mentally healthy environment on board? Do people have the tools and techniques to look after themselves? Do they understand about what you mentioned, Marty, about breathing techniques, for example, really simple tools and techniques that people can use on a day-to-day basis to enhance well-being? There's lots around, and I think, as you say, that sort of training of people to understand mental health and know how to look after themselves is really important. But then we need, in addition to that mental health promotion and creating the positive environment, etc., and the training and stuff, we need support and response mechanisms. So in the last section of Mentally Healthy Ships there, it breaks that down into sort of 3 areas. One is the kind of response mechanisms to the common mental health issues that we might find, the normal day-to-day stresses, the things that affect people when something happens at home that gets on top of people, kind of how to support crew around that. And then also the more sort of mental health emergency kind of scenario, which might be related to things like suicide prevention, or if you, the rare occasion, although it does happen, the occasional mental health emergency in terms of an acute mental health crisis for somebody with a more severe or mental illness as such, which is quite rare in the shipping industry, but it does happen occasionally. And then the third one being about the major incident response. And in that, as we've been saying, what's really important is to be prepared and have a plan in place. And there's a number of options around best practice for responding in a critical incident and incorporating it into the immediate response. And some of those were talked about in your workshop last time. And you know, there's a range of things that could be offered, and it really probably depends on the company and the context and your makeup in terms of staffing structure and so on, what would work best, whether it would be about training up the people who would naturally probably be the ones that are going to be involved in managing the critical incident, or whether you might already have a team of well-being champions in the company, for example, who could get that extra training on trauma awareness, or whether it's about bringing an external provider in using one of the evidence-based models. So one word of caution is that it really is easy or certainly possible to cause harm after a traumatic event. And you've mentioned some of the things like blame, like being part of the event, like having to get on with it and act as if nothing's happened. You know, it can be, you know, we can do harm. So I would suggest that two things. One, if you're thinking about moving forward with this, perhaps read Mentally Healthy Ships. There's also Neil Greenberg's guide, Managing Traumatic Stress, Guidance for the Maritime Industry. It's a few years old now, but it's good evidence-based guidance. Have a read of those, and then have a think about where you're at in your company situation. Review where you've got to in your plannings and procedures, what you've already got. And then probably I would suggest have a conversation with myself, with Rachel, with one of the speakers from last week, somebody that's got that professional expertise who can help you work out what the right kind of solution would be for your context. Just to make sure that you're putting in good practice, evidence-based practice, and you won't be doing any harm by doing that. So that would be my first thought. Just very, very quickly, one thing that came up earlier on when Anne, I think you were talking about the investigation process. For me, what I've seen often is that companies sort of hunker down after a critical incident, and there's sort of management containment, there's investigation, you know, there might be legal processes going on, there might be, but there's certainly kind of nobody wants to talk about it outside. They want to sort of try to keep it quiet. And what that means often is that the people at the center get forgotten about, and they don't get communicated with, and their families don't get told what's going on, and everybody's in a really heightened state of stress and shock and wanting information. And so even at that really basic level, it's like talking to people, you know, of course, there's all these other things that restrict what can be said in a public forum. But for me, that's one of the barriers, is that there's this panic reaction, hunker down, hide what's going on. And the poor old seafarers and their families at the center of it get forgotten about. So yes, I just thought I'd mention that as well.
That's
hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful, hugely helpful as ever, Penny. And I think you've given some really great guidance and direction there for people who want to follow this up for themselves in their roles in their companies. So yes, the Mentally Healthy Ships and Professor Neil Greenberg's document in 2016, I think, gives some really good evidence-based, assured foundations that you can build your response to. So as we're coming towards the last part now of our Last Steps webinar, time just swings by. I would like us all on panel and our audience as well, I'd like us to consider two things. A call to action, what you'd like to see the industry doing in terms of taking trauma-informed action, and also a pledge. What change could you bring to your environment, to the way that you work, that would make your actions and the impact that you make more trauma-informed? And so I guess I'd just like to put that to our panel. We've probably got, in order to make sure we've got time for our Q&A, I'd like you just to take a minute each, really, just to consider those two ideas: a call to action and a personal pledge. So Marty, I don't know whether I could come to yourself first.
Yeah, I think I'm very much biased in this question and even more in my answer.
Right.
Yes, we are trying to spread trauma awareness and with these two webinars, and I sincerely hope that we don't stop here. And we do see that there's more awareness. I'm very glad to see that we have ship owner management and crews participating in our webinar, so we are getting somewhere. And the second part, I'm not shy. I will keep on spreading awareness and try to challenge others to do the same with our good partners. And I think, as it came across the panel, it's something that needs to, similar way that it's not a taboo anymore to talk about mental health, that we need to, these two are very much interlinked and connected. We need to have more industry acceptance, awareness, and to have a better industry. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Marty. And how about yourself, Chris? I wonder what you would like to challenge the industry to do, and what you feel that you could take forward personally in your role.
Yeah, I think without wanting to blow my own trumpet, but having been through quite a lot of these things personally, I've always tried to apply my lived experience to when I do the investigations, which I think is really important. If you can be professional and carry out a balanced investigation and still display some empathy to the crew that are involved, and I think that's critical. I think in terms of what's got to happen, or what I think should happen, it has to start with increased awareness, as Marty said, and that's the whole point of this webinar. I think what the industry probably would benefit from is dealing with, there's always going to be the investigation side of things and the legal side of an incident, which I'm heavily involved in, and the outcome of that is normally it's basically somebody's fault. Because that's the way it works. And I think sometimes the industry doesn't look at why that person made that decision. It's just a case of that decision was made, this happened. And I think Anne touched on this earlier on. And that's something that would help the individuals involved. Yes, there's some bad people out there who make intentionally bad decisions, but there's also a lot of people out there who don't make a mistake. We're awake for 40 hours, as we said earlier, and something goes wrong. And I don't think the support's there to help them out. Why were you awake 40 hours? Why did this happen? It's just a case of it happened, done. And that person carries that with them right the way through until it manifests as something possibly quite serious. So that's it in a nutshell. I think that was about a minute.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. So following that learning, continuing that learning beyond that just one point. That's great. And so how about yourself, Anne? What would you say would be your challenge and your pledge?
Okay, I'm going to really struggle to keep this to time, so I may have to talk really fast. So my challenge to the industry would certainly, and this is aimed primarily at the IMO and flag states, I would say initially, is to improve availability of trauma-informed training to tackle that identification and prevention. I think Penny touched on it as well, the various stages of where we need to go. And to me, we need to start this at the root. So PSSR training for psychological, including psychological safety for new entrants, and refresher training, human element training. We have human element training for management level, but we do not give, for example, future captains tools and guidance on how to address if somebody comes to them with an allegation that one of their crew members has undergone sexual assault, for example. So if we're not giving our leaders on board, let alone our leaders ashore, guidance on how to be trauma informed and how to adequately respond, we're just compounding the problem. Mental health first aid training, this is becoming increasingly standard in shore applications. We're lagging behind as an industry, in an industry where we have mental health concerns of isolation. And on that topic of isolation, internet for seafarers should be a standard. We talk about the power of communication with the 21st century. The internet and being able to access support of family and friends can be the difference. So that to me is my challenge to the industry. For my own personal pledge, working as I am for a shipping company and a technology company, is that I will certainly be looking at how we can improve our structures, our organizational structures for the management of incidents, making sure we have risk matrices that give equal importance to psychological injury as they do to physical injury, and the classification of incidents, but also the management post-incident, making sure our post-incident structures and checklists and how we work through our investigations, our interviews of personnel, making sure they are trauma informed. We are not forcing people to recount over and over trauma that can be damaging to them. And also considering the effects on families, as we were just touching upon. It's not just the seafarer. The seafarer goes home to their family and friends, and they are a support network, and they are very much part of the seafarer that works for us. And certainly Ocean Infinity, we have one of our values is that we enable people and the planet to thrive. And it's very easy to focus on the planet, and we want to be very sustainable and zero emissions, but we also want to do zero harm to people, and that includes psychological harm. So for me, my pledge, certainly in my small corner of the industry here in Ocean Infinity, is to make sure we can help step up and do that.
Grand. That's a very comprehensive view, and I look forward to the day when many people can make those pledges as well. We see those echoed back at us through the industry. Penny, I wonder if I could reduce you to 30 seconds. Would that be okay?
Yes, well, I've already given some of it, haven't I, in terms of actions to take. So yeah, review where you're at, take things step by step. Perhaps get advice from professional contacts, make sure they're not doing any harm. Just if you're new to this, a plug for my own stuff. I've got a training, an open access training coming up in January for mental health awareness, and for the first time we've got open access suicide prevention as well. So if you're new to sort of thinking around mental health and mental health awareness more generally, those kinds of trainings, and the one I think somebody else has put up, Marty, you've put one up as well. So yes, that's the thing really. Just look at where you're at and work out the next steps. I guess make a pledge generally towards care for staff, and think about how to progress that. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Penny, and thank you for your brevity there. And we will look those opportunities up. We've got a number of different questions that have come through our Q&A. Thank you ever so much to those listening in today for putting these questions forward. I wonder if I could ask our colleague Stephanie to be able to put some of those questions to us now.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to the Q&A section of the webinar. I will be the voice of the participants for this part of the discussion. So I'll be reading from the Q&A chat box and selecting some questions for our panelists to answer. Okay, let's jump right in. The first question will be for the panel in general. We have a participant who is asking, who is really supposed to champion this? They're making the point here that seafarers have a very high workload already, and that management is so far removed from what's happening at sea. So I wonder how we can better bridge the gap between shoreside management and the crews on our vessels.
Mm. So, Anne, did I see your hand going up then? Would you like to take that response?
I was going to say that the sounds awfully stock and generic, but communication. And I really think that it does come down to communication. There are Sea Health, I think they might have changed their name now, but it's a Danish organization that produced an excellent publication about generally bridging the gap between ship and shore. I think it was called Ship and Shore on the Same Wavelength or something like that. And communication is key. Are we talking to our seafarers? Do we know our seafarers? Do we know where the risks are for trauma that they may be experiencing? How are we communicating with them? Are we communicating with them enough? And are we communicating with them on their wavelength? Or are we bombarding them with PowerPoints that have communication topics and general intonation meant for a management boardroom rather than people on the front line on a ship that read it and just want to say, hello, this is the real world, it's not like this. I know ship visits have been very difficult in the last couple of years through COVID. Doing it through Teams or other methods just isn't the same, but we can still make sure our communication is adapted to the people we are speaking to. It's a very basic management principle, but I think it's very often overlooked in the gulf between ship management and seafarers in general, and especially in topics such as this.
Thank you, Anne.
Excellent, thank you so much. I'll just mention here, I see that we are running over time now. We might continue for another few minutes and hope that our attendees can stay for the last few questions. Moving on to the next question in our Q&A box here, we have an attendee who is talking about the sensitivity of trauma strategy and how we can balance all aspects of shipping operations in the strategies for our trauma response. They are referring to all kinds of different situations such as environmental conditions, nationalities, economic commitments between operators, and they're asking for some realistic, practical and measurable proposals.
Yeah, I think that might sounds like a penny question.
Yeah, I think it's worth trying to differentiate different types of issues. So we have those day-to-day stressors associated with a life at sea, and they might require different kinds of responses than a critical incident. So a critical incident being the major incidents that happen that we've touched on. So there's a plan and proposal that needs to be in place for a critical incident, but then there's the more day-to-day sort of management of the normal stresses of life that we all go through and the impact of that on our lives. And that is around, I think, having trying to reduce stigma around having conversations about mental health, having good tools and techniques to take care of yourself, but also having accessible and confidential support systems and structures. So there's lots we can do around that. And I think that's where certainly that's the level at which my mental health awareness training is pitched, and I think probably many of them are. And so please look into some of those, because I think that we've got some quite good resources out there as well. There's also some self-help guides, actually. I'm forgetting about that, but I wrote some self-help guides a few years ago, which are also free to download on the ISWAN website. There's one called Positive Steps to Mental Health, there's Psychological Wellbeing at Sea, and there's Managing Stress and Sleeping Well at Sea. So they've got sort of evidence-based tips, tools, techniques for taking care of yourself. But in our mental health awareness training, what we often do is have shoreside and seagoing staff together, officer level, top 4 often, and key shoreside staff, and look at, what are the stressors? How can we respond? We teach people kind of response mechanisms, psychological first aid, first response, and how to link people up for extra support if they do need it, that kind of thing. So there's quite a bit out there, I think, and it's growing all the time. But just make sure your resources and your sources are credible and evidence-based.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for your answer there, Penny. I see that we're 5 minutes over time now. Thank you to all the attendees for your questions. I'm very sorry that we haven't had time to answer them all today. I'm going to pass over to Johanna, our host, now to finish off the session.
We are going to close up today's webinar now. Thank you for your patience staying around for some last questions. And as Stephanie said, sorry for that all questions didn't get an answer. It's really a shame that we have this time limit. I would like to acknowledge that you as an attendee of today's workshop are important for spreading knowledge about how to prevent and manage psychological trauma in our industry. This webinar aims to push you out there a bit to help raising awareness about trauma. So please do that, raise awareness and also use the tools that you have learned in our workshop and in this webinar in your own organization. And last, remember also it's really important to remember to also take care of yourself. You are then more able to help others. Thank you, attendees, for participating, and a huge thank you to our great moderator and our brilliant expert panel.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Thank you very much to Alandia and to Johannes and Marty and Stephanie to help bring this together, and to our panel as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.